Stephen, what a pleasure it is to have you here at the Center for Middle East Studies. Thanks for joining us.
Always good to be with you, Danny.
So I'd like to start with the title of the lecture that you delivered here last night, Upheaval as Opportunity. And then you set out your prescriptions for a new policy direction for the United States and the Middle East. What do you mean by upheaval as opportunity?
Sometimes I think that when we Americans look at the world, we assume that the global balance of power is something that's permanent and fixed. Of course, we're always going to be on the top. Some other countries are going to be just below that. Other countries are not going to have much influence. And that effectively, the pieces on the global chessboard have been nailed into place. But I don't think that's really true. The fact is, and history shows this, there are moments when we can move the pieces around. Circumstances change, environments change, and then policies should change with them, including alliances. So when we look at the Middle East today, we're seeing a situation that seems to many people quite terrifying and really bad. We had a lot of stability there. Everything seemed calm. Now everything's in upheaval, so that's bad. But actually, we're in a situation that effectively was inevitable when you consider how the modern Middle East was configured. And there were situations and tensions in that region that were inevitably going to explode. We're now seeing some of that, and we should, I think, realize that, particularly from the American point of view, there are great opportunities for us to improve our position in the world by lightening our footprint in the Middle East and reassessing the constellation of alliances and partnerships that we've had in place for so long. And so that's a way of moving around those pieces on the Middle East chessboard.
Now, you've actually been making this argument for years. This is what's interesting. Before the upheavals that are sometimes called the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, in this book, Reset, you put forward a very bold argument about the need for the United States to rethink its relationship with four principal countries in the region. Saudi Arabia and Israel on one side of the ledger, which had formed, as you argue, sort of the core of U.S. policy in the Middle East, going back to the immediate post-World War II period, and then Iran and Turkey on the other, which you argue could be the key allies of the United States. Now, this is an argument that you set forth starting around 2007, 2008, 2009. Reset came out in 2010, and as I mentioned in my introduction last night to your lecture, it seemed to me that this book came out at an unfortunate time for its argument. It was ahead of its time in many ways, but it was also something of a stillborn argument in the sense that when the book came out, Iran was undergoing, not when you wrote it, but when the book came out, Iran was in the middle of a major crackdown on dissent. The Green Movement leaders were being rounded up and thrown into prison and tortured. The world was not open to this argument at the time. I think that this is an interesting moment now, after the Arab Spring, with the election of Rouhani in Iran, with these interesting signals being sent from Saudi Arabia, with the fissure between Washington and Tel Aviv on the Iranian nuclear question. It seems to me that a new constellation has emerged in which the argument you set forth in Reset could have a new lease on life.
It's interesting that you put it that way. I hadn't quite thought of it that way, that's true. This book didn't do as well as some of my other books, and maybe that was one of the reasons, that proposing Iran as a potential partner for the United States seemed crazier than ever at the moment when this book came out. But I have noticed that these days there's a renewed surge of interest in this book, which is something I haven't seen in any of my other books, that years after it comes out, suddenly you see great interest in it, even greater than there was at the time that it did come out. I think what's happening is that history is asserting itself, as it always does, and fundamental interests of countries ultimately emerge out of the miasma of emotion. So the idea that the United States could be some kind of a partner with Iran seems a little bit more rational now. If interests are the ultimate reason and basis for the way countries act, and I believe that to be the case, then let's examine what interests Iran and the United States might have in common. First of all, I'd say this. When countries choose allies and partners, they should be looking for two things, two criteria when they're choosing partners. One should be, you want to choose a country whose society looks something like your own society. And Iran is very much like ours. Their democratic society has not produced a democratic government the way Turkey's has. But they have known about democracy since they established their constitution 100 years ago. And in many ways, they have a thriving democratic consciousness in Iran that you don't see almost anywhere in the Arab world because they don't have experience with constitutional government. So that's one criteria, and Iran fulfills that. It is a society, not a government, but a society that looks a lot like American society. People think in many ways about democracy and government the way we do.
And as you've pointed out, the Iranian people are almost embarrassingly pro-American in their sensibilities.
They tremendously admire the United States, which I think is something that we don't really grasp here. But the second factor is interests. You want to choose a country as your partner whose interests are congruent with yours. That's why Saudi Arabia fails, I think, on both of those criteria. Saudi society looks nothing like ours, and Saudi interests in the long run are not our interests. But Iran has many long-term interests in common with ours. Here are some of them. First of all, Iran has a huge ability to stabilize Afghanistan. The whole western third of Afghanistan used to be part of Iran. They speak the Iranian language. There's tremendous contact there. Iran, of course, also has great influence in Iraq. Iran is the center of Shiism. Iraq also now has a Shiite-led government where there are great sectarian problems. So the ability to calm Iraq and Afghanistan is something that should be very valuable to us. We are terrified, as we should be, of the idea that when we leave Afghanistan, the place will explode in some terrible way. That would be awful for us. Iran can help prevent that from happening and can try to stabilize Iraq if it has a reason to do so as part of a global arrangement. Beyond that, you can think of a number of very practical problems. I think the most urgent one would be this horrific drug problem that's now afflicting Iran. Iran is terrified at the flow of heroin coming in from Afghanistan. The United States has been saying for years that we need to address the fact that 90% of the world's heroin is coming from poppies grown in Afghanistan. Here's a great project for Iran and the United States to work together on. And perhaps most important, Iran is the mortal enemy of radical Sunni movements like Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Leaders of those movements want to kill all Shiites. And so the Iranians were hating the Taliban when we were still dealing with the Taliban, and we liked them. So if you want a partner in the Middle East to fight against jihadist extremism in the form of Taliban and Al-Qaeda ideology, Iran is more eager to do that than any other country. And meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, our longtime ally, is pouring huge amounts of money into the fomenting of these very jihadist groups that are our greatest enemies in the world.
Now, at this very moment, as we sit here talking, Secretary of State John Kerry and his Iranian counterpart, Javad Zarif, who's actually a graduate, did his PhD here at the University of Denver at the Josef Korbel School, are in Geneva talking about the nuclear issue. What are your hopes? What's your prognosis for these talks, for this process, and what's your read on the international reaction to even the prefigurations of this process, even the signals that it was going to start? Both Israel and Saudi Arabia seemed rather unsettled by this. What's your sense of the Obama administration's path forward on this issue?
I think there is an understanding in some places in Washington now of this factor that I just discussed, that actually a partnership with Iran can promote American security interests. Now, that's still very much a minority view. As long as we are negotiating on the basis of mutual interests, we're going to succeed. But the problem is, there's another factor that overwhelms that, and that is emotion. we are caught up in a spiral of anti-Iran emotion, and there's a lot of anti-American emotion in parts of the Iranian leadership. Somehow we need to overcome that emotion, get through that fog to see the reality of our mutual interests. And I think these talks are a promising sign that at least some important people on both sides, Iran and the United States, are coming to realize this. However, there are powerful groups, both in Washington and in Tehran, that are seriously threatened by the idea of reconciliation. And they are working to undermine it. So you have kind of a radical fringe in Iran and a radical fringe here. But unfortunately, certainly in the United States, that fringe is not really a fringe. It's more or less the mainstream. When you want to get members of Congress to sign a letter denouncing Iran, like they did the day before Rouhani even took office, you have no problem getting hundreds of signatures because this emotion has really taken hold of us. So I think you're going to have a problem, not so much at the negotiating table in Geneva, but you're going to have a series of other problems. One is back in Tehran. How are the Iranian leaders now who want to promote reconciliation going to sell this project to their militant hardline factions? How are President Obama and Secretary Kerry going to sell the idea of a new relationship with Iran to Americans? And of course there's this other factor that the Israeli influence in Washington is being used as a way to try to prevent this reconciliation, since the leadership in Israel feels that this reconciliation could be dangerous for Israel. And I think you're going to see all these other factors playing in so that the actual discussions about mutual interests of the two countries in Geneva are only a piece of the puzzle.
But it's interesting how the Saudi and Israeli reaction to this process, in some ways, what we're seeing is the very point you make in this book play out, which is that the SaudiIsraeli Axis, if you will, because they are now very much on the same page. They have been for a while, actually, but it's coming into focus, I think, in a sharper way now. And I think this really gets back to the argument of your book, which is that and it's interesting to me how sometimes the argument that Saudi Arabia, our ally in the region, is upset about this possible rapprochement or even talking with Iran. This is trotted out as somehow an argument against doing it, that the Saudis are freaked out by it. Isn't that kind of an odd argument?
I think the fact that Saudi Arabia finds this terrifying actually is a good sign for us. You can see a lot of what's happened in the Middle East in recent years through the lens of the Iran-Saudi Arabia competition. And we've always assumed that Saudi Arabia had the big upper hand in this competition because it had the biggest ally in the world, the United States, unquestionably supporting its positions. That's not happening anymore. And I think the fundamental contradictions inside Saudi society are now coming to the fore. We are realizing that although Saudi Arabia has a discourse of being an ally and a great friend of the United States, and they talk about all the checks they've written for all of our projects, we realize now that actually Saudi Arabia has been a great funder of jihadist ideology, that there's tremendous conflict under the surface in Saudi Arabia about what might be happening in the future after the elderly king passes away. And Saudi Arabia has problems it has to resolve itself. We shouldn't be subcontracting our foreign policy to any other country. And I think it works both ways. Let Saudi Arabia not subcontract its foreign policy to the United States. Let Saudi Arabia follow its own interests. But we in the United States should realize that in the long term, many of Saudi Arabia's security interests are not ours. Actually, in some cases, Saudi interests conflict with ours. And I think it is very interesting, as you point out, that the only other country in the world that's as terrified of U.S.-Iran reconciliation as Saudi Arabia is Israel. So there's this old trope that, well, Saudi Arabia is one of the leading Arab countries. All Arab countries are against Israel, so that's the big clash. But this is not correct. Actually, as you point out, in many ways, Israel and Saudi Arabia are desperate to maintain the old way the Middle East was designed. But that design was put together to serve two interests. First of all, there was the Cold War. So we needed anti-Moscow allies, and Israel and Saudi Arabia fit that bill. Secondly, we needed oil, and we were getting it from Saudi Arabia and its allies. But both of those situations have changed now. The Cold War is over. The energy situation in the world has changed tremendously in ways that make us much less reliant on Saudi oil. So as those situations change, we realize that we're not as automatically tied to Saudi Arabia as we have been in the past. So as the environment changes, policies should change. But change is always difficult, especially for those who felt very secure in the old system. When those people protest, it's logical. But we shouldn't necessarily be moved by that and be diverted from the idea that we should pursue our own interests, which is, in a sense, the only real basis for long-term foreign policy.
Stephen, thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Always great. Thank you, Danny.